The transport vessel Dominion's Reach hummed through the void between star systems, its cargo hold filled with the spoils of another successful conquest. Among the various alien prisoners and confiscated technology sat a single human male, hands bound behind his back with energy shackles that would have crushed the bones of most species. The human appeared unremarkable to his captors. Average height, lean build, wearing the tattered remains of some primitive military uniform. What they didn't know was that Staff Sergeant Marcus Ghost Patterson had just become the most dangerous prisoner in the entire Galactic Empire. Marcus kept his breathing steady and his expression neutral as he studied his surroundings. The Valtharian guards were typical of their species, 8 feet tall, heavily muscled, with chitinous armor plating that covered most of their torso. Their weapons were energy-based rifles that could punch through reinforced steel. Impressive, but Marcus had faced worse odds in the mountains of Afghanistan, with nothing but his rifle and his training. The capture had been a setup from the beginning. 3 days ago, Marcus had been part of a reconnaissance mission on the outer colony of New Texas when the Empire's fleet had emerged from hyperspace. The colonists had scattered, but Marcus had volunteered to stay behind and provide covering fire for the evacuation transports. He'd managed to take out 17 enemy fighters with a modified rail rifle before they'd finally cornered him in the communications tower, but getting captured had been part of his plan. The Empire had a reputation for interrogating prisoners at their fortress station of Kethmoran, a massive military installation that served as the regional command center for this sector. Intelligence suggested that the Empire was planning a major offensive against Earth and the other human colonies. Marcus needed to get inside that station, and the only way past their defenses was to let them bring him there themselves. Commander Zexthul of the Imperial Guard stood before the human prisoner, his 4 eyes studying the strange biped with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Humans were a relatively new addition to the galaxy's catalog of species, having only achieved faster-than-light travel within the last century. Most species took millennia to develop such technology. The rapid advancement had caught the Empire's attention, but not in a good way. "You are the one who eliminated 17 of our fighters," Zexthul stated, his translator device converting his chittering language into something the human could understand. Impressive for such a primitive species. Marcus said nothing, maintaining eye contact without showing defiance or submission. It was a skill he'd learned during seer training, how to appear compliant while gathering intelligence. "Your weapons technology is crude but effective," the commander continued, pacing in front of Marcus with predatory grace. "We have analyzed the weapon you were using, a simple magnetic acceleration device, nothing we haven't seen before. Yet you used it with remarkable precision. Tell me, human, what is your designation?" "Patterson, Marcus J. Staff Sergeant, United States Army. Serial number 123456789. Zexthul's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. "Name, rank, and identification. How quaint. We have moved beyond such primitive military structures millennia ago. You will find that your training has not prepared you for Imperial interrogation techniques." The transport shuddered slightly as it dropped out of hyperspace, and through the small viewport, Marcus could see their destination. Kethmoran was even more massive than the intelligence reports had suggested, a sprawling complex of interconnected structures that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Defensive platforms bristled with enough firepower to level a planet, and patrol ships moved in precise formations around the perimeter. As they docked, Marcus committed every detail to memory. Guard rotations, docking procedures, the layout of the hangar bay, all of it would be useful when the time came to leave. And he would be leaving, though not in the way his captors expected. The processing center was designed to intimidate, with soaring ceilings and walls covered in the banners of conquered worlds. Marcus recognized a few: the crimson spiral of the Centauri Federation, the silver star of the Proxima Alliance. Each represented billions of lives now under Imperial rule. "Prisoner 847 Alpha," announced the processing technician, a smaller Veiltharian with specialized data manipulation appendages. "Species, human, Terra designation. Combat effectiveness, moderate threat level, assigned to Detention Block 7 for standard interrogation." Marcus noted the classification system as they escorted him through the station's corridors. The Empire was systematic, efficient, but they had made one crucial error. They had classified him as a moderate threat based on his species and equipment, not understanding that the deadliest weapon any human possessed was their mind. The detention cell was a cube of energy barriers surrounded by solid walls, designed to hold creatures far stronger than humans. Marcus settled into the center of the space and began his real mission. Every guard rotation, every announcement over the station's communication system, every vibration through the deck plates, he cataloged it all, building a complete picture of the station's operations in his mind. On the second day, they brought him food, a nutritional paste that was supposedly compatible with human biology. As the guard activated the feeding slot, Marcus caught a glimpse of the corridor beyond his cell. Detention Block 7 contained 43 cells, currently holding 31 prisoners of various species. Most appeared broken, defeated. But in Cell 15, he spotted something interesting. A blue-skinned humanoid who moved with the controlled grace of a fellow warrior. The interrogations began on the third day. They started with standard psychological pressure, threats against Earth, promises of mercy for cooperation, displays of Imperial military might. Marcus responded with textbook resistance techniques, giving them nothing but maintaining the appearance of someone slowly being worn down. "You are wasting our time, human," Zexthul growled during one session. "We have broken creatures far stronger than you. Your resistance is admirable but futile." "I don't know what you want me to tell you," Marcus replied, injecting just the right amount of exhaustion into his voice. "I was just following orders, covering the evacuation. The evacuation was successful because of your actions. You must possess tactical information about human military capabilities." Marcus almost smiled. They were fishing, which meant they knew less about human military doctrine than they pretended. Good. Let them underestimate what they were dealing with. Meanwhile, he had been busy. The energy shackles that bound his hands were sophisticated but designed for species with different joint structures. Human shoulders were remarkably flexible compared to most galactic species, and Marcus had spent hours slowly working to increase his range of motion. The Veiltharians had searched him for weapons, but missed the tiny ceramic blade sewn into his uniform's collar, a blade that would be invisible to their metal detectors and energy scanners. The break came on the 5th day when they brought in new prisoners from a failed rebellion on Kepler 442b. The processing created enough chaos in the detention block that Marcus was able to make contact with the warrior in Cell 15. Her name was Kira Lin, a former commander in the Andromedan Resistance before her capture 6 months earlier. Unlike the other prisoners, she hadn't been broken by Imperial interrogation. She had been waiting, planning, gathering intelligence just as Marcus had been doing. "You're different from the others," she whispered during the brief window when the guards were changing shifts. "You still think like a soldier." "Marines don't surrender," Marcus replied. "Army doesn't quit. I've heard rumors about your species. They say humans are unpredictable, that you fight beyond logical limits. We prefer the term creative problem-solving." Kira Lin's expression might have been a smile. "I have a proposal for you, human. The Empire is planning to move me to the execution chambers tomorrow. But I know things: security codes, guard rotations, the location of the station's main computer core. Help me escape, and I'll help you complete whatever mission brought you here." Marcus considered the offer. His original plan had been to work alone, to find a way to the communication center and transmit Earth's coordinates to the resistance networks he'd identified during his intelligence gathering. But having an ally who knew the station's layout could dramatically improve his chances of success. What makes you think I'm here on a mission? Because no one lets themselves get captured unless they need to be somewhere specific. And this station is the most secure facility in 3 sectors. You didn't end up here by accident. She was sharp. Marcus had to give her that. What's your plan? Kira Lin outlined a strategy that was both audacious and brilliant. The station's defensive systems were designed to prevent external attack and internal breakout, but they had a blind spot. The waste processing system that removed atmospheric contaminants and biological waste from the detention blocks wasn't considered a security risk because it was too small for most species to navigate. But humans and Andromedans were smaller than the average galactic citizen. The processing ducts connect to the main recycling center on level 47, Kira Lin explained. From there, we can access the maintenance corridors that run throughout the station. I've been mapping them during my time here. Security cameras? The maintenance areas aren't monitored as heavily. The Empire assumes that if someone can access them, they're already dead or captured. Marcus nodded slowly. It was risky, but it was also exactly the kind of unconventional approach that had made human military tactics so effective against superior forces throughout history. Sometimes the best way through a fortress wasn't through the front door. When do we move? Tonight, during the sleep cycle, when the guard rotation is at minimum staffing. As the station's artificial day cycle dimmed to simulate night, Marcus made his final preparations. The ceramic blade sliced through the energy shackle's focusing crystal with surgical precision, causing a feedback loop that would take several minutes to trigger an alarm. He had learned that much about Valtharian technology during his capture. The cell's energy barrier required more creativity. Marcus had observed that the barriers were generated by emitters in the ceiling and floor, creating a containment field that could hold virtually any known form of matter or energy. But they were designed with the assumption that prisoners would try to break through directly. Instead, Marcus used a technique he'd learned in urban warfare training. If you can't go through an obstacle, go around it. Or in this case, under it. The floor of the detention block was solid metal, but like all space stations, Kethmaran had been built in sections that were then assembled in orbit. That meant seams, joints, and access panels for maintenance. Marcus had spent days studying the vibration patterns in the deck plates, mapping the underlying structure. Using his fingernails and the ceramic blade, he slowly worked loose a floor panel that was just barely within his cell's boundaries. It took hours of careful work to avoid triggering pressure sensors, but eventually he created an opening large enough to slip through. The space beneath the detention block was cramped and filled with conduits and data cables, but it was unmonitored. Marcus crawled through the narrow space, following the path he'd memorized from the station schematics he'd reconstructed in his mind. 20 meters forward, then left at the junction, following the waste processing line toward Kira Lin's cell. He found her waiting in a similar space beneath her cell, having used a piece of metal torn from her food dispenser to create her own exit. Together, they crawled through the maintenance spaces toward the waste processing center, moving in absolute silence. The processing center was a vast chamber filled with recycling equipment and atmospheric scrubbers. More importantly, it was empty during the sleep cycle, running on automated systems. Marcus and Kira Lin emerged from the access tunnel like ghosts, quickly orienting themselves in the industrial environment. "The main computer core is 7 levels up," Kira Lin whispered, pointing toward a maintenance shaft that led into the station's superstructure. "But the security there will be intensive." "That's not where we're going first," Marcus replied, studying the chamber's layout. "We need to level the playing field." He led her to a secondary control panel that managed the station's atmospheric systems. While the Veiltharians had taken his weapons, they hadn't considered that any sufficiently advanced technology could be turned into a weapon with the right knowledge. Marcus's training had included courses in enemy equipment and infrastructure. Every military installation, regardless of species or technology level, had certain vulnerabilities. Life support systems, power distribution networks, communication arrays, all of them were potential targets for someone who understood how to exploit them. "What are you doing?" Kira Lin asked as Marcus began manipulating the atmospheric controls. "Creating a distraction?" Marcus replied, his fingers working quickly across the alien interface. The Empire's technology was more advanced than human systems, but the basic principles of atmospheric processing were universal. Oxygen levels, pressure regulation, temperature control, all of it could be adjusted with the right access codes. And Kira Lin had provided those access codes. Marcus began implementing a plan that would have made his instructors proud. Not a direct assault, but a gradual degradation of the station's environmental systems that would force the crew to focus on life support instead of security. Subtle enough to appear like equipment failures rather than sabotage, but extensive enough to create chaos throughout the facility. As alarms began sounding in distant parts of the station, Marcus smiled grimly. The Empire was about to learn that capturing a human sniper was one thing. Containing one was something else entirely. The real mission was just beginning. The maintenance corridors of Kethmaran Station were a maze of pipes, conduits, and access ways that stretched through every level of the massive structure. Marcus and Kira Lin moved through them like predators stalking prey, using the growing chaos from the atmospheric system failures to mask their progress toward the upper levels. Emergency lights bathed everything in a red glow as automated systems struggled to maintain proper life support throughout the station. Marcus had programmed the failures to cascade slowly, each one triggering additional problems that would keep the engineering teams busy for hours. Oxygen levels dropping in Sector 7 would cause emergency protocols to activate in Sectors 5 and 9. Temperature fluctuations in the residential quarters would trigger humidity controls in the command sections. It was a symphony of system failures that appeared random, but would systematically degrade the station's operational efficiency. "Your species has a talent for chaos," Kira Lin observed as they paused at a junction where 3 corridors met. She consulted a small device she'd constructed from components scavenged during her months of captivity. A primitive but effective sensor array that could detect Veiltharian life signs through the station's bulkheads. "Marines call it improvised solutions," Marcus replied, studying the corridor ahead. "Army calls it making do with what you have. Special forces call it Tuesday." They had been moving for 3 hours, climbing through 17 levels of the station's superstructure while avoiding regular patrols and maintenance crews. The atmospheric problems Marcus had created were working exactly as planned. The station's personnel were spread thin, responding to emergencies throughout the facility instead of maintaining normal security protocols. But as they approached the command levels, the security became more sophisticated. Energy barriers blocked certain corridors. Biometric scanners required authorized personnel to proceed, and automated defensive systems could deploy lethal force without warning. The Empire hadn't maintained galactic dominance for 3 centuries by being careless about protecting their strategic installations. "The main computer core is behind those barriers," Kira Lin said, pointing to a corridor that glowed with contained energy fields. "I've seen the schematics. 3 separate checkpoint systems, each one requiring different authorization levels." Marcus studied the security setup with a professional eye. The barriers were impressive, but designed with certain assumptions about how attackers would behave. Most species would attempt to overpower the defenses or find ways to circumvent them electronically. The Empire's security designers hadn't considered more creative approaches. "Tell me about the guard rotations up here," Marcus said, settling into a comfortable observation position. "How many personnel?" What species? What equipment? 12 guards per shift, all Valtharian elite troops. Energy weapons, powered armor, enhanced communication systems. They rotate every 4 hours, with overlapping patrols to ensure continuous coverage. What about the barriers themselves? Are they continuous or do they cycle? Kiralyn looked puzzled. Continuous. That's the point of a security barrier. Marcus smiled in a way that would have made his enemies nervous. That's what they want you to think. But even the most advanced energy systems have power requirements and heat dissipation needs. Watch. For the next 20 minutes, Marcus observed the security barriers with the patience that had made him one of the Army's most effective snipers. He wasn't looking for weaknesses in the energy fields themselves, but for the subtle signs that would reveal the underlying infrastructure supporting them. There, a barely perceptible flicker in the leftmost barrier every time the station's main power grid cycled, and there, a slight thermal variation in the corridor walls where cooling systems were managing heat buildup from the energy emitters. Most importantly, there, a maintenance access panel that was positioned just outside the barrier's coverage area, but connected to the same power distribution network. The barriers are tied into the station's primary power grid, Marcus explained to Kiralyn, but they also have independent backup systems to prevent exactly what I'm thinking of doing. However, those backup systems have to be tested regularly to ensure they function properly. You can't possibly know their testing schedule. I don't need to. I can create one. Marcus led Kiralyn to the maintenance panel he'd identified. Using techniques he'd learned from Army engineers, he began carefully modifying the power distribution circuits, not enough to cause immediate failure, but enough to create precisely timed fluctuations that would trigger the automated testing protocols for the backup systems. The beauty of sophisticated technology, Marcus said as he worked, is that the more sophisticated it becomes, the more ways it can malfunction. The Empire's engineers designed these barriers to be virtually impenetrable, but they also designed them to automatically test their own systems for reliability. The first fluctuation occurred exactly as Marcus had predicted. The barrier flickered for less than a second as the backup systems engaged their testing cycle. Not long enough for most species to react, but Marcus had spent years training to take advantage of opportunities measured in fractions of seconds. When I say move, we go through together. Don't hesitate. Don't look back. Just run. The second fluctuation lasted 0.8 seconds. The third lasted 1.2 seconds. Marcus was learning the system's timing patterns, calculating the optimal moment to make their move. The fourth fluctuation would be the one. The testing protocol would engage all backup systems simultaneously, creating a window of exactly 2.3 seconds when the barriers would cycle off. Now! They sprinted through the checkpoint during the brief window, Marcus's timing proving absolutely precise. The barriers reactivated behind them just as Kiralyn's trailing foot cleared the energy field. Ahead of them lay another corridor, another checkpoint, and another opportunity to demonstrate that human tactics could overcome superior technology. The second barrier required a different approach. This one incorporated motion sensors and thermal imaging, designed to detect unauthorized movement regardless of species or technological countermeasures. But Marcus had noticed something during their approach. The sensors were calibrated for the movement patterns of upright bipedal species. "Can you move like a quadruped?" he asked Kiralyn. "I can adapt my posture, but why would—" The sensors are programmed to identify threats based on locomotion patterns. They're looking for beings that move like soldiers or saboteurs. They're not looking for beings that move like maintenance equipment, Marcus demonstrated, dropping to his hands and knees and moving with the slow, deliberate pace of an automated cleaning unit he'd observed earlier in the maintenance areas. The sensors tracked his movement, but classified it as routine station operations rather than a security threat. "Your species really is insane," Kiralyn muttered, but she followed his example. Together, they crawled past the second checkpoint, moving with mechanical precision that fooled the sophisticated detection systems. The third barrier was the most challenging: biometric scanners that required authorized genetic patterns to deactivate. This seemed like an impossible obstacle until Marcus realized that the Empire's efficiency was working against them. "The maintenance crews," he said, studying the scanner array. "They have to service these systems regularly, which means there has to be override protocols for when authorized personnel aren't available." He found what he was looking for in the scanner's diagnostic interface: an emergency maintenance mode that could be activated remotely from the station's command center, but it could also be activated locally if the right sequence of system failures occurred simultaneously. Marcus began implementing his most audacious plan yet. Using the atmospheric control access he'd established earlier, he triggered a cascade of environmental alerts throughout the command section. Simultaneously, he used his modifications to the power grid to create fluctuations in the lighting systems. Finally, he overloaded the thermal regulation in the corridor, causing temperature spikes that would register as potential fire hazards. The combination of alerts triggered the station's emergency protocols. Rather than risk personnel in a potentially dangerous situation, the automated systems activated emergency maintenance mode for all security barriers in the affected section. The biometric scanners powered down with soft chimes, their displays showing amber standby lights instead of the harsh red of active security mode. "Incredible," Kira breathed. "You turned their own safety systems against them." "Every system has exploitable features if you understand the underlying assumptions," Marcus replied. "The Empire assumes that attackers will try to break their security systems. They don't expect attackers to convince the systems to break themselves." They passed through the final checkpoint and found themselves in the command section's primary corridor. Ahead of them lay the main computer core, the heart of Kethmaran Station's operations. But between them and their target were the 12 elite guards that Kira had mentioned. And these wouldn't be fooled by atmospheric problems or maintenance protocols. Marcus studied the guard positions through a service grate, noting their formation patterns and response procedures. Veltharian elite troops were formidable opponents, faster than humans, stronger than most species, equipped with weapons that could level buildings. In a direct confrontation, even a dozen human special forces operators would face significant casualties. But Marcus wasn't planning a direct confrontation. "The guards rotate every 4 hours, he observed, "but they don't all move at once. 2 guards remain at the core entrance while the others conduct their patrol circuits. The patrols follow predictable routes, but they vary their timing to prevent exploitation." "So we wait for the rotation and try to take advantage of the confusion?" "No, we make our own rotation." Marcus had noticed that the command section used a different atmospheric system than the rest of the station, a backup network designed to maintain operations even if the primary life support failed. It was a smart design that prevented exactly the kind of systematic assault he'd been conducting throughout the station. But it also meant that the command section's environmental controls were isolated from his previous modifications. He would need direct access to affect them, and that access was in the computer core chamber itself. "I need you to create a distraction," Marcus told Kira, "something that will draw most of the guards away from the core entrance without triggering a station-wide alert." "What kind of distraction?" Marcus smiled grimly. "The kind that makes them think they've found us." He outlined a plan that would use Kira knowledge of the station's layout to create a false trail leading away from the command section. By triggering security alerts in a carefully planned sequence, she could make it appear that the escaped prisoners were attempting to reach the station's docking bays. The guards would respond according to their training, leaving only minimal security at the computer core. "That will give me approximately 12 minutes to access the core, complete my mission, and establish our extraction route," Marcus explained. Extraction route? We're in the middle of the most secure military installation in 3 sectors. How exactly do you plan to get us out of here? The same way I plan to get in. By making the Empire's own systems work for us instead of against us. Kira Lin departed to begin her part of the plan, leaving Marcus alone in the maintenance corridors above the computer core chamber. He used the time to complete his final preparations, checking his improvised equipment and reviewing the mission parameters that had brought him here. The intelligence about an Imperial offensive against Earth was accurate. Marcus had confirmed it during his surveillance of the station's communication traffic. The Empire was assembling a fleet that would dwarf anything humanity had ever faced. Thousands of ships, millions of troops, weapons capable of cracking planetary crusts. It would be a campaign of complete annihilation designed to prevent humanity from becoming a long-term threat to Imperial dominance. But the Empire's plans depended on detailed intelligence about human military capabilities, industrial capacity, and defensive preparations. That intelligence was stored in the computer core below, compiled from months of reconnaissance and infiltration operations. Marcus's mission was simple in concept, but incredibly complex in execution. He needed to access the Empire's intelligence files, delete their strategic data about humanity, and replace it with false information that would lead their fleet into a carefully prepared trap. The Joint Earth Colonial Defense Force had been preparing for this moment, positioning their most advanced ships and weapons in systems that appeared lightly defended, but were actually death traps for unwary invaders. The deception would only work if the Empire believed their intelligence was accurate and uncompromised, which meant that Marcus's infiltration had to remain undetected until it was too late for them to adjust their plans. Kira Lin's distraction began exactly on schedule. Emergency lights flashed in the distance as security alerts announced the detection of escaped prisoners in the station's industrial section. Marcus watched through the service grate as 8 of the 12 guards departed to respond to the threat, leaving only 4 personnel to protect the computer core. 4 guards was still a formidable obstacle, but Marcus had advantages that weren't immediately apparent. The Valtharian guards were trained for combat against conventional threats, enemy soldiers, saboteurs, assassins who would attack with weapons and tactics they could recognize and counter. They weren't trained to fight a ghost. Marcus had earned his call sign through years of operations where invisibility was more valuable than firepower. He could move through hostile territory for days without being detected, eliminate targets from impossible distances, and disappear before anyone realized what had happened. The Special Forces community had a saying about snipers like Marcus. They didn't fight fair, they fought smart. The first guard fell without ever knowing Marcus was there. A pressure point attack that rendered the Valtharian unconscious in seconds, followed by the careful placement of the body in a location that would suggest the guard had suffered a medical emergency rather than enemy action. The second guard presented more of a challenge, positioned where the others could see him clearly. Marcus waited patiently for the right moment, using a piece of reflective metal to redirect light from the corridor's illumination panels. The guard investigated what appeared to be equipment malfunction, stepping just far enough from his post for Marcus to strike. The third guard noticed his colleague's absence, but assumed he had responded to the ongoing security alert. Marcus let him call for backup, then used the guard's own communication device to send a false confirmation that the missing personnel had been reassigned to the perimeter search. The fourth guard was the most dangerous because he was positioned directly in front of the computer core entrance, with clear sight lines in all directions. Marcus couldn't approach without being detected, and any disturbance would trigger alarms that would bring reinforcements flooding into the command section. So Marcus didn't approach. Instead, he used a tactic that would have seemed impossible to most military strategists. He made the guard come to him. A carefully placed electromagnetic pulse, generated using components from his improvised toolkit, created interference in the core chamber's security systems. Nothing dramatic enough to suggest sabotage, but significant enough to require investigation by qualified personnel. The guard followed his training perfectly, entering the chamber to diagnose the apparent equipment failure. Marcus was waiting inside, having entered through a ventilation shaft that connected to the atmospheric processing systems. The guard never had a chance to raise an alarm. Alone in the computer core chamber, Marcus finally allowed himself to appreciate the scale of Imperial technology. The core was a massive crystalline structure that processed information at quantum speeds, managing the data flows for an installation that coordinated military operations across hundreds of star systems. It was beautiful, elegant, and absolutely lethal to anyone who didn't understand how to interface with it safely. Fortunately, Marcus had spent months studying captured Imperial technology. He knew exactly what he was doing. The access interface required genetic authentication, but Marcus had prepared for that obstacle. The unconscious guards provided the necessary biological samples, and a simple medical scanner from his toolkit could replicate their authorization patterns well enough to fool the security systems. As the core accepted his credentials and granted access to the strategic databases, Marcus began the most critical phase of his mission. The false intelligence had to be perfect, detailed enough to convince Imperial analysts, but subtly flawed in ways that would lead their fleet into destruction. He worked quickly but carefully, replacing accurate data about human defensive positions with information that would make the Empire's targets appear vulnerable when they were actually fortified. Ship positions were altered to suggest that humanity's most advanced vessels were protecting secondary colonies instead of the primary industrial worlds. Defensive capabilities were downgraded to make Imperial forces overconfident about their technological superiority. Most importantly, Marcus planted intelligence, suggesting that Earth's orbital defense platforms were still under construction and wouldn't be operational for several months. In reality, the platforms had been completed weeks ago and were equipped with weapons based on captured Imperial technology, weapons that could destroy even the Empire's most advanced dreadnoughts. As he completed the data manipulation, alarms began sounding throughout the station. Kirilin's distraction had run its course, and the security forces were returning to their normal positions. In minutes, they would discover the unconscious guards and realize that the computer core had been compromised. But Marcus's mission was complete. The false intelligence was in place, the real data had been destroyed, and the Empire would base their invasion plans on information that would lead them to defeat. Now came the most dangerous part: getting out alive. Marcus activated the final component of his plan, using his access to the computer core to send a priority communication to the coordinates he'd memorized before his capture. The message was brief, encoded in a frequency that appeared to be routine maintenance data to Imperial monitoring systems. Package delivered. Initiating Extraction Protocol 7. 27 light-years away, Admiral Sarah Chen received the transmission aboard the stealth cruiser Defiance. Marcus's infiltration had succeeded, but now came the equally critical task of ensuring his survival to provide operational intelligence about the Empire's capabilities. "Begin jump calculations for Kethmoran Station," Admiral Chen ordered, "and prep the combat teams. We're going to get our sniper back." The command section of Kethmoran Station erupted into chaos as emergency klaxons blared and security teams rushed to respond to the discovery of unconscious guards near the computer core. Commander Zexthul arrived within minutes, his 4 eyes taking in the scene with growing fury as he realized the scope of the breach. "Report!" he barked at the security chief, a veteran Vialtharian whose chitinous armor bore the scars of dozens of campaigns. 4 guards incapacitated, all showing signs of precise neural disruption. No weapons discharge, no signs of struggle. The perpetrator used advanced close-quarters techniques. The security chief consulted his data pad with trembling appendages. The computer core was accessed 17 minutes ago using valid authentication codes. Authentication codes? How is that possible? The codes belong to the unconscious guards, sir. Somehow the intruder was able to replicate their genetic signatures well enough to fool our systems. Zexthul's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation among his species. The human prisoner, where is he now? Missing from detention block 7 along with the Andromedan female. We believe they escaped during the atmospheric system failures that began 6 hours ago. System failures? Zexthul's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Or sabotage? The security chief's silence was answer enough. The commander turned to study the computer core, its crystalline structure pulsing with the flow of vast amounts of data. What files were accessed? We're analyzing the access logs now, sir, but the intruder was inside our systems for over 15 minutes. He could have copied or altered virtually anything in our strategic databases. The full implications hit Zexthul like a physical blow. The core contained detailed intelligence about the Empire's planned offensive against human space, ship positions, target priorities, tactical assessments. If that information had been compromised, the entire campaign could be in jeopardy. Lock down the station. Nothing moves without my authorization. Deploy all available security teams and begin a level-by-level search. The human is still here somewhere. But Marcus Patterson was no longer thinking about hiding. 3 levels above the command section, he and Kira Lin were implementing the most audacious escape plan in military history, one that would use the Empire's own preconceptions about human psychology against them. You want us to surrender? Kira Lin stared at Marcus in disbelief as they crouched in a maintenance alcove, listening to the sound of search teams moving through nearby corridors. After everything we've accomplished? Not surrender, Marcus corrected. Appear to surrender. There's a difference. He outlined his strategy quickly, knowing they had only minutes before the search teams reached their position. The Empire expected escaped prisoners to try to reach the docking bays, commandeer a ship, and flee into space. They would never expect prisoners to attempt to take control of the station itself. The station's primary command center is 2 levels above us, Marcus explained. If we can reach it during the chaos of the search operation, we can access the station's defensive systems and communication arrays. To do what? We can't fight off the entire Imperial fleet. We don't have to. We just have to survive long enough for cavalry to arrive. Kira Lin looked puzzled until Marcus activated the emergency communicator he'd improvised from components taken from the computer core chamber. The device was crude but functional, capable of transmitting on frequencies that the Empire wouldn't be monitoring because they assumed no one else knew they existed. Ghost calling Overwatch. Package delivered, requesting immediate extraction support. The response came through layers of static and interference, but the voice was unmistakably Admiral Chen's. Overwatch confirming package delivery. Extraction force is 23 minutes out. Can you maintain your position? Negative. Compromise is imminent. Initiating contingency protocol. Understood, Ghost. Good hunting. Marcus deactivated the communicator and turned to Kira Lin. 23 minutes. We need to hold the primary command center for 23 minutes against whatever the Empire throws at us. You're insane. Beautifully, brilliantly insane. They moved through the station's superstructure like smoke, using Marcus's knowledge of Imperial security protocols to avoid the search teams that were methodically clearing each section. The electromagnetic pulse devices Marcus had created from maintenance equipment served dual purposes. They could disable Imperial electronics while simultaneously masking human life signs from the station's biosensors. The primary command center was protected by the most sophisticated security systems on the station, but those systems were designed to prevent external attack rather than infiltration from within the station's own structure. Marcus and Kira Lin approached through utility conduits that connected to the center's atmospheric processing systems, emerging in the climate control room that served the command facility. "12 personnel on duty," Marcus observed through a maintenance grate, studying the command center's operations. 4 at the tactical stations, 3 on communications, 2 monitoring internal security, 3 at the main command consoles. "All Valtharian elite officers," Kira Lynn added. "These aren't guards. They're the station's senior staff. Each one is worth a dozen regular soldiers in combat capability." "Then we'll have to be worth 2 dozen each." Marcus had spent his entire military career learning to overcome superior numbers and equipment through tactical innovation. The command center presented unique challenges, but it also offered opportunities that wouldn't exist anywhere else on the station. The climate control system that kept the command center at optimal temperature for Valtharian physiology could be adjusted to favor human biology instead. Marcus began making subtle modifications that would gradually increase temperature and humidity to levels that would impair Valtharian reaction times while having minimal effect on humans. Simultaneously, he accessed the center's communication systems through their connection to the station's internal network. Imperial communications were encrypted and secured, but Marcus wasn't trying to break their encryption. Instead, he was introducing carefully crafted interference patterns that would degrade signal clarity and create confusion during critical moments. "You're poisoning their environment," Kira Lynn realized as she watched Marcus work. "Stacking the deck in our favor. When we make our move, we'll have every possible advantage." The attack came 27 minutes earlier than Marcus had expected. Commander Zexthul had correctly deduced that the escaped prisoners would target critical station systems, and he had prioritized the defense of the command center over the continuing search of the detention levels. But Marcus had planned for that contingency. As the first security team reached the command center's outer perimeter, Marcus triggered a cascade failure in the station's primary power grid. Not enough to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to force an emergency lockdown of all critical systems. Blast doors sealed throughout the station, emergency lighting activated, and automated defensive systems switched to local control. The command center found itself isolated from the rest of the station, its personnel trapped inside with whatever threats might already be present. Marcus and Kira Lynn struck during the confusion of the power failure, emerging from the climate control room as the command center's lights flickered and backup systems engaged. The modified environmental conditions were already having their intended effect. The Valtharian officers moved slightly slower than normal, their reaction times degraded by the temperature and humidity changes. The first officer fell to a precise nerve strike that Marcus had learned from captured Imperial combat manuals. Valtharian anatomy was different from human physiology, but the principles of pressure point manipulation remained constant across species. The second officer managed to reach for his weapon before Kira Lynn disabled him with techniques from her own military training. Within 90 seconds, Marcus and Kira Lynn had neutralized 8 of the 12 command center personnel. The remaining 4 had managed to activate the center's internal defenses, energy barriers that separated the main command consoles from the rest of the facility. "You cannot escape," Commander Zexthul's voice echoed through the command center's communication system as he attempted to establish contact from outside the sealed blast doors. "Surrender now, and I will ensure you receive honorable treatment as prisoners of war." Marcus activated the command console's external speakers. "Commander, this is Staff Sergeant Patterson, United States Army. I'm calling to inform you that this facility is now under new management." "Impossible. You are 2 beings against an entire military installation." "Actually, we're 2 beings who control your entire military installation. Allow me to demonstrate." Marcus had spent his time in the computer core chamber, learning more than just how to alter intelligence databases. He had also studied the station's operational systems, mapping the connections between various control networks. Now, with access to the primary command center, he could implement changes that would affect every aspect of the station's functionality. The lights throughout Kethmaran Station began flashing in a complex pattern, not random flickering, but a carefully orchestrated sequence that spelled out a message in standard galactic binary code. Human-controlled facility. Approach at your own risk. Simultaneously, Marcus activated the station's external communication arrays and began broadcasting on emergency frequencies used by every species in the galaxy. The message was simple but devastating to Imperial authority. This is Kethmoran Station. We are experiencing a change in management. All Imperial forces are advised that this facility is no longer under Empire control. You are bluffing, Zexthul transmitted, but uncertainty crept into his voice. You cannot control an installation of this complexity with two individuals. Can't we? Marcus activated the station's external defensive systems, rotating the massive weapon platforms to target the Imperial patrol ships that maintained security around the station's perimeter. Your ships are now in my crosshairs, Commander. I suggest you reconsider your tactical position. The truth was that Marcus couldn't actually fire the station's weapons. The firing controls were protected by multiple authorization systems that even his access to the command center couldn't override. But the patrol ship commanders wouldn't know that, and the sight of defensive platforms tracking their movements would be enough to give them pause. What Marcus could control was the station's internal systems: life support, artificial gravity, electromagnetic fields, power distribution, and he was using that control to methodically disable the station's ability to function as a military installation. 14 minutes, he told Kirillin as she monitored the sealed blast doors that separated them from the rest of the station. We need to hold for 14 more minutes. The Imperial response was swift and predictable. Unable to breach the command center's defenses without risking damage to critical systems, Zexthul ordered his troops to cut through the station's hull and assault the center from outside. It was a dangerous tactic that could compromise the station's structural integrity, but the commander had correctly determined that recovering control of the facility was worth the risk. Marcus watched the external cameras as Imperial engineers began their cutting operation. Time to play our final card. He activated the station's general alarm system, broadcasting on all internal channels with an announcement that would change the strategic balance throughout this sector of the galaxy. Attention all personnel. This station is now under the protection of the Terran Defense Force. Imperial forces attempting to retake this facility will be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly. This message will repeat every 60 seconds until Imperial forces withdraw to a safe distance. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. For 3 centuries, no force in the galaxy had successfully challenged Imperial authority on this scale. The idea that a primitive species like humanity could seize control of one of the Empire's most important strategic installations was beyond the comprehension of most galactic civilizations. But the message was being broadcast on frequencies that reached every inhabited system within 50 light years. Word would spread rapidly through the faster-than-light communication networks that connected the galaxy's various species. The Empire's reputation for invincibility would be shattered, and every oppressed world would begin to wonder if resistance was possible. 8 minutes, Kirillin reported, watching the Imperial engineers work to breach the command center's external bulkhead. They'll be through the hull in approximately 6 minutes. Perfect timing. Marcus began his final preparations, using the command center's fabrication systems to create equipment from raw materials stored throughout the station. The devices he assembled were crude but effective: improvised explosives, electromagnetic pulse generators, and area denial weapons that would make any assault on their position prohibitively costly. But more importantly, he activated the station's automated distress beacon, broadcasting on frequencies that no Imperial facility should ever use, the emergency channels monitored by the resistance movements that operated in the shadows of every occupied world. The message was simple. Kethmoran Station has fallen to human forces. The Empire can be defeated. Rise up. 2 minutes. Kirillin announced. Then, more quietly, "It's been an honor serving with you." "Save the speeches for the after-action report," Marcus replied with a grin. "We're not dead yet." The first explosion came not from the Imperial assault teams, but from outside the station. Massive energy discharges that lit up the darkness of space as Admiral Chen's task force dropped out of hyperspace and engaged the Imperial patrol ships. The stealth cruiser Defiance had brought friends, a full squadron of Earth's most advanced warships, equipped with weapons that had been developed in secret using captured Imperial technology. "This is Admiral Chen to all Imperial forces. You are ordered to stand down and withdraw immediately. This station is now under Terran protection." The Imperial response was predictably aggressive. Their patrol ships moved to engage the human fleet while the assault teams continued their attempt to retake the command center. But Admiral Chen had not come unprepared for a fight. The human ships moved with tactics that bewildered their opponents: irregular formations, unpredictable maneuvering, weapons firing patterns that seemed chaotic but were actually precisely coordinated. It was the difference between military doctrine developed over millennia of galactic warfare and the creative improvisation of a species that had spent its entire history fighting against superior odds. One by one, the Imperial patrol ships fell to human weapons that struck with devastating accuracy. The assault teams attempting to breach the command center found themselves trapped between Marcus's prepared defenses and Admiral Chen's Marines, who had teleported directly into the station using technology that the Empire didn't know humans possessed. "Ghost, this is Marine Force Leader Johnson. We're coming to get you out of there." "Negative, Johnson. Secure the station instead. This facility contains intelligence that Earth Command needs to analyze." "Roger that, Ghost. Outstanding work." As the battle raged throughout Kethmoran Station, Marcus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The mission had succeeded beyond his most optimistic projections. Not only had he corrupted the Empire's intelligence about human defenses, but he had also demonstrated to the galaxy that Imperial forces could be defeated by determined resistance. The false information he had planted in the computer core would lead the Empire's invasion fleet into a trap that would destroy their military capability for decades to come. The capture of Kethmoran Station would provide Earth with advanced technology and strategic intelligence that would accelerate human military development by generations. But most importantly, the psychological impact would inspire resistance movements throughout the galaxy. The Empire's hold on power depended on the perception that resistance was futile. Marcus had shattered that perception in a single operation. "Commander Zexthul," Marcus transmitted as human forces completed their seizure of the station. "This is Staff Sergeant Patterson. I'm calling to inform you that your services are no longer required. You and your personnel will be treated according to the established protocols for prisoners of war." The reply came after a long pause. "How? How did your primitive species accomplish this?" Marcus smiled as he watched Admiral Chen's ships establish a defensive perimeter around the captured station. "Commander, you made one fundamental error in your assessment of humanity. You assumed that being primitive meant being predictable. We prefer to think of ourselves as creatively unpredictable. This changes nothing. The Empire will send fleets to retake this station. Actually, Commander, this changes everything. And those fleets you're planning to send, they might want to reconsider their approach. We'll be ready for them." As Kethmoran Station settled under human control and Admiral Chen's forces began the process of analyzing Imperial technology and intelligence, Marcus finally allowed himself to relax. The mission was complete, but he knew it was only the beginning of a much larger conflict. The Galactic Empire had captured a human fighter, not knowing he was an American sniper. They had learned too late that capturing a human and containing one were very different propositions. And now the entire galaxy would learn that humanity was not a species to be underestimated. The war for galactic freedom had begun, and it had started with one soldier who refused to accept that any mission was impossible. Marcus Ghost Patterson had proven that even the most powerful empire in the galaxy could fall to human determination, creativity, and the simple refusal to give up when the odds seemed insurmountable. In the years that followed, military historians would study the Kethmoran operation as a masterpiece of unconventional warfare. But for Marcus, it was simply what humans did when their backs were against the wall. They found a way to win, no matter how impossible victory seemed. The galaxy would never be the same.